Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Society and to this Asia Society Policy Institute program on Japan's defense policy. We are here today because Japan has released 3 new strategy documents at the end of 2022 outlining a bit of a departure from the traditional analysis and prescriptions for Japan's defense policy in the Indo-Pacific and the world. And we have with us a couple of wonderful experts to unpack some of the implications of this change in strategic analysis and recommendations. I'd love to introduce to you Ken Jimbo. Professor Jimbo is the Managing Director of the International House of Japan and President of the Asia-Pacific Initiative. He is also a professor at Keio University, but also recently served as special advisor to Japan's Minister of Defense and senior advisor at Japan's National Security Secretariat. Ken is going to give us an overview of his analysis of the changes in Japan's national security policy, and then we'll have a bit of a moderated discussion with my colleague, Danny Russel. Danny is our Vice President for International Diplomacy and Security at the Asia Society Policy Institute, where he comes to us after a distinguished career in the U.S. government, most recently serving as Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, as well as having served in Japan in a number of roles, including as U.S. Consul General in Osaka, Kobe. So as I said, I'm Rorry Daniels. I'm the Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'd like to now turn the floor over to Professor Jimbo for a brief presentation of his analysis of Japan's changing national security policy.
Thank you. Good morning, and I'd like to begin by thanking Asia Society Policy Institute for kindly organizing this panel. And very glad to be back in New York. I think it's first time in a couple of years, and especially glad to see all of you in person. So as Rorry has already laid out, that Japan has just gone through quite a historic benchmark of the change of the Japan's security strategy. We have adopted the 3 strategy simultaneously. One is called the National Security Strategy, followed by National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Policy Planning Paper, altogether with 100-page. And I think I would like to highlight a few about what has been the feature of the strategy paper that we have adopted, and what would be the policy implication for our national defense policy strategy, and also for the relation with the United States under the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I think it was the featuring of the fundamental reinforcement of the defense capabilities of the Japanese self-defense force, including the iconic introduction of the capability for the long-range strike capability, which might sound like quite a huge departure from our exclusively defense-oriented defense, which focus on the territorial defense in a manner that we confine ourselves to the peaceful orientation of the Constitution for long years, and committed ourselves to not fight in the foreign states and engage in the combat somewhere outside the territory. But I guess that this time we have expanded the geography of our defense commitment through the numbers of the capability that we are going to introduce in the next 5 to 10 years. And with all things to make it possible, we also have decided to increase substantially on the defense budget, which aims at almost like a 2% of the Japan's GDP by year 2027, which will include like a 43 trillion yen worth of the total size of the defense budget in next 5 years. And I think on the annual basis, what's going to happen in 2027 will be that our defense budget will almost like a double than what we have right now in 2023. So that has been the major decision that we have adopted so far in December. And let me also outline what really made such a decision and what are the major features. And I think that a couple of things. One is that I think we are having an increasing awareness about severe security environment surrounding Japan. And in our document, we have highlighted China, North Korea, and Russia as a major security challenges. And we define China as the greatest security challenge in our document, followed by North Korea as a grave and imminent threat with nuclear missile capabilities, and Russia as a strong security concern. And I would like to note that this has been the great departure from our previous national security strategy in 2013, where you found that we defined Russia as more in the positive manner by having like a comprehensive relationship with Russia. We can actually, I think, like a diversified interest of Russia, not only to align with China in every strategic issue they face in the Pacific, but by having economic relationship with Russia, that at least that we can make China's Russia's calculation in a much more complex manner. So that was, I think, a strategic intention that we had back in 2013. But I think with the Ukraine crisis and those outcomes, that such kind of calculation is now over. So I think we are now facing with three major front lines with having quite different natures of the threats. And each has a different sets of the customization of the defense preparedness. Definitely that it entails a lots of resources that we need to spend. And secondly, NSS also has quite a deterministic viewpoint that how the characterization of the severity of the threat may play out in Japan's national security. And because it begins with symbolic lines of thoughts, begins with globalization, and the interdependence alone cannot serve as a guarantor for peace. And this is quite a provocative way of looking at the world affairs, and because it intends to alter the so-called liberal peace type of premises. And in conjunction with that, NDS follows up by saying that Japan should focus on adversaries' capability rather than the intention. So with a combination of those, I think this is quite a realistic, realist approach based on the skepticism on the economic relations and the peaceful intention of the adversaries needs to be downgraded, and we have to really squarely face with the capability that is surrounding Japan, and we need to prepare for that capability-based approach. And the third, I think, Taiwan Strait crisis has become the real scenario, which that is the I think emerging awareness that the Japanese public now facing. And the Ukraine crisis really contributed the Japanese people's recognition that the reality of such a contingency, potential of such contingency will become, the reality for the future. And if that happens, that requires a robust capability for high-end scenario, which is, quite different from what we used to suppose for, like a Senkaku Diaoyutal controversies over, East China Sea, and how we try to have those kind of comprehensive way of engagement is more like a low-end type of scenario. But if something happened in Taiwan that is robust, that is high-end, that also needs the reconfiguration of our defense policy as well. So let me also highlight a few, taking some minutes to the 3 quick points on what Japan is going to achieve in our 3 documents. And first of all, I think as an overarching concept, I think what we are going to achieve is the strategy of denial. And I think this is the, definitely the important concept that we have adopted since December. And coming back to our previous National Defense Program guideline we have adopted almost like 5 years ago, it's already said that the Japanese self-defense force is no longer able to sustain the air and naval superiority vis-a-vis China. And this is some kind of a very, severe recognition of what will play out in looking at the material balance of power between SDF and also the People's Liberation Army in terms of the size of the 4th and 5th generation fighters, surface vessels, and missiles, and all sorts of assets that to be compared. It is very hard for Japan to squarely face with the material kind of size that the PLA is now obtaining. It's going to obtain for the future. So what could be the potential option for Japan if we think that the time is on the China's side if we only focus on the material balance of power? And I think that what we aim to achieve is the SDF capability to deny the Chinese prospect of the operational success in major scenarios. And mainly on Taiwan and also on the Senkaku and others through a couple of like a denial concept. For example, for part 1 would be the sea denial. And if you go to Japan and Yokosuka and look at the Pacific Ocean, it's wide open. But if you go to Qingdao in China or Hainan, islands, it's a major flotilla basis there. But the Pacific Ocean is not that open at all because a Chinese vessel has to go through the very narrow straits, including Miyako and Bassey Straits, so that even though that the material power balance would not be balanced at all, if we could concentrate on your forces in terms of the finding the vulnerability of such kind of operation, and that can serve as a denial force. And this is, I think, a very important concept. And the second is like a denial in the amphibious warfare as well. By having a kind of a Taiwan full-scale scenario, China has to send those ground forces onto Taiwan through the amphibious mission. And that is really a vulnerable operations. And by exploring China's operational vulnerability and then Japan having capability to strike through the anti-ship missiles and those, and that will again complicate the Chinese strategic calculation over their prospect of the success in those scenarios as well. So these are the baseline of the strategy of denial which we are trying to adopt. And this is where the long-range strike capability or the counter-strike capability comes into place because if we talk about the 1,500 kilometers of the anti-ship missiles, and that is exactly the length between Kyushu and the Taiwan Strait. So I think that will indicate what is going to play out. The second is the operational resilience, and there were much to learn from the Ukraine forces' current battle against Russia, and which reminds us how important that the SDF needs to prepare for war-fighting capability with operational resilience. So in our 3 documents, we have highlighted the improving of the operational mobility and tempo. That is very much in need. And the second is more investment on the ammunition and the fuel, which is to maintain our operational capability in the longer run. And the third is the defense facilities. Obviously, that we would like to strengthen our infrastructure of the bases and facilities, not only the SDF, but also for the U.S. forces in Japan in order to secure the U.S. operational capability to fight inside the theater. Even though that the A2AD capability will be expanded eastwards, we would like to, secure the U.S. operational capability, inside the theater. And finally, the networking is a quite important concept, and I'll stop here. And it's quite encouraging to find out our documents that, the most of our, efforts, which has been described in the document, is about Japan's own measures, and it is about what Japan should do. But by looking at how the composition of the Japanese security strategy, U.S.-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of our security policy. So recent 2+2 meeting that we have earlier last week, that we have committed ourselves about the more capable, integrated, and agile alliance with our new capabilities. How self-defense force can expand its role in the alliance will be a heavily important concept, which will expand our operational kind of scope in reviewing our roles and missions and capability types of the arrangement between two allies. So this is the moment how we can really realign ourselves and how we can really fight together and defend together for the stability in the Indo-Pacific. And eventually, finally, that collaboration with the like-minded countries are also the very important subject for Japan. That involves Australia. We have just came up with the reciprocal access agreement with them, so we're able to have the asset protection for the Australian forces, and we are ready to accept Australian engagement in Northeast Asia by provision of our facilities and utilization of many of the logistic materials with them, and those are, I think, symbolically and practically very important legal platform between Japanese and Australia, and India and European friends, including NATO and ROK and ASEAN. Those are, I think, the sets of the lines that we are going to expand our relationship, and through that, Japan alone will be decreasing its portfolio nationally because of the size of the economy still. But again, with having a new portfolio, by having new friends and allies, emerging powers to be incorporated into the portfolio of our security policy, and that's going to be a force multiplier for our future orientation or defense. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Professor Jimbo. That's been a very comprehensive overview of what Japan is thinking and considering as it looks at its forward defense policy, including this new emphasis on capabilities, on a strategy of denial, on some skepticism and realism in its outlook on global affairs, operational resilience and networking. Danny, as someone who has followed Japan's policies and worked on the U.S.-Japan relationship in government throughout the years, what's your reaction to these documents and to the presentation by Professor Jimbo?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you and welcome to everybody. My reaction to Ken's presentation is, as you said, that it's a very helpful analysis, and those were useful insights, I think, into this important set of documents. You, I think, correctly describe it as a milestone or a turning point, inflection point, and so on. That said, and maybe because of my extensive Japan engagement, I'm tempted to caution that we should look at this not so much as a snapshot as maybe a time lapse, that this is the culmination of a process in Japan that I think has been underway certainly for a decade. I mean, when you look at the counterstrike capability issue, or you look at the virtual doubling of the defense budget, it feels like a dramatic turning point, and it is very significant. But it's not entirely, it's certainly not coming out of nowhere. It's not so much a U-turn as it is, I think, an acceleration. There's been an evolution in not just Japanese defense doctrine, but in Japanese attitudes, in Japanese society and self-image, as you mentioned, the sort of liberal peace conceit, the notion that if we love peace, we will be in a peaceful region. I think that has been overtaken by events, and that, as you said, globalization, it's understood now, and it's clear in the national security strategy, doesn't ineluctably lead to or guarantee security. And I think that obviously among the drivers of shifting security calculus unquestionably is the geometric increase in the threatening capabilities and the threatening evidence of intent out of Pyongyang, North Korea, both in terms of missiles, many of which now have been deliberately fired into the Sea of Japan, and in the massive nuclear arsenal that's growing. Obviously, as the documents refer to, there is the dramatic uptick in the capabilities of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, as well as a vastly more assertive national approach to areas of disagreement, including the Senkaku Daiyutaya, since the ascension of President Xi Jinping. And of course, Russia, the loss of innocence or naivete about what could be hoped for from Putin, and the evidence of the unprovoked attack on Ukraine. And also I think that the years of the Abe government served to break down some taboos and to shift mindsets a bit. So that's one steady set of trends, I think. Another is what to me looks like the evolution of the U.S.-Japan alliance from, let's say, from a protectorate type status to a bona fide partnership type status. And from the perspective of the United States government, I can speak from memory, not from a position, is that for Japan to, on its own terms and in its own right, decide to significantly enhance its defense capabilities is all to the good. This is a really important and valuable positive shift in the regional dynamic, in the calculus. Japan's contribution to deterrence and therefore to regional security is unique. There is no other country that can do the things that Japan can do, not only because of the size of the Japanese economy and the strength of the self-defense forces to begin with, but also because of the serendipity of geography. And the fact that Japan, as an Asian country with its own history, its own culture, its own diplomatic connections, chooses, not as a puppet of the Americans, but as part of a domestic sort of awakening, to equip itself to better deter and defend in the region, I think is seen very differently by the countries in the region than the Pax Americana of the Seventh Fleet and U.S. forces in the region. And those two capabilities combined, and they are combined, and that's very important, I think add immensely to the prospects for peace and security in the region, in Asia more broadly, in the Senkakus in particular, and specifically in deterring adventurism across the Taiwan Straits. Now, I happen to believe, in addition to the drivers that you mentioned and that I just repeated, There is also the experience of 4 years of Trump administration in which the United States appeared to be not merely turning its back on the alliance, but turning on allies and demanding remuneration, demanding concessions, establishing linkage, etc. And it is not hard to understand why, behind closed doors and within Japanese halls of power, people began to ask themselves if Japan doesn't actually need to have some of its own autonomous capabilities, because questions about the long-term full reliability of the United States have been raised. I think it's eminently to the credit of the Japanese government that they remain determined to embed any enhancement of Japan's own freestanding capabilities in the broader alliance, and that's the reason I think no one in the U.S. government is concerned, but rather heartened by this trend. But it's something that as Americans we should regard with some introspection, if not humility. The last thing I'll say is that we're not home yet. Japan's not home yet. Today is the first day of the diet session where the budget is going to be debated, and it is a huge increase in defense spending at a moment when not just the global economy, but the Japanese economy is under considerable stress, so that's not going to be easy. Japan's system and military has its own challenges, including woefully underdeveloped information security system that prevents the free flow of sensitive intelligence at the level that I think would serve both countries' interests. And there are also other issues like the need to develop Japan's defense industry and capabilities and so on. There's a lot of work to be done in the military industrial base. Acquisition of new capabilities have long timelines, and we don't know that world events will necessarily wait. But what I'd end on is the importance of the fact that clearly these decisions in Tokyo are not the result of American arm twisting. These are decisions that are being made according to a transparent and logical calculus by Japanese decision makers, strongly supported by the Japanese public. And while I'm not in a position to speak for the countries of Asia, it is definitely my impression that the effort by some in China and elsewhere to raise the specter of Japanese militarism, etc., is falling very flat. That this is not something that is particularly worrisome to the countries of Southeast Asia or South Asia. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Danny. Let's pick up on that last set of points that Danny had made about some of the challenges that Japan is facing in enacting a more ambitious security strategy. I'd like to ask you how these changes have been received in Japan. Are there concerns that budget trade-offs are going to be a larger part of the public debate? And do you think the public agrees with the shifts in Japan's security environment, described as the most severe in decades, require this new approach?
Sure. I guess that the historic benchmark to increase the defense budget from the long-standing 1% of the GDP to double the size, it's an enormous decision that the government has been taking, quite similar to what the German has done in late February after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In last July, when we had the upper house election, and surprisingly, that 70% of the Japanese, according to the many polls, have suggested that they are supporting the increase of the defense budget. in December, when we adopted the document, still the majority of the numbers, like 51, 55% of the public reply that we definitely need a robust increase of the defense budget. But interestingly, when Prime Minister Kishida called for we need to have tax hike, so you have to pay for those. And then 70% of Japanese said, no, we're not going to pay for it. So it's quite a interesting way that we definitely perceive the severe security environment that needs to have our own efforts to increase the capability of the defense. But when it comes to how much they can really sacrifice themselves in the economic terms, there were lots of ambivalence towards to that end. So I think Danny was quite right that we have just started the diet session. And then what it's fundamentally have is aging population, the increase of the medical, social welfare types of the expenditure will be skyrocketing in Japan. National debt status has not been, remedies at all. And then we also declare that there will be the increasing amount of money to be paid on the child care policy as well. So lots of demands are there, but we also have to secure our resources on the defense, which is an enormously difficult task. And the Ministry of Finance is now very frustrated in this. So I think this is the currently strained situation. It is not the kind of linear things way forward. But in terms of the defense, the Kishida's decision has already included that how much we are going to secure the budget at least until 2027.
Wonderful, thank you. Danny, I'd like to go back to Professor Jimbo's points about networking alliances in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is the cornerstone of many security and defense partnerships in the region, and the emphasis on these bilateral arrangements does kind of reinforce the idea that the U.S. has a hub and spoke structure for its alliance relationships in the Indo-Pacific. Japan's been more forward, I think, than other allies and partners in establishing its own separate bilateral defense agendas and partnerships with U.S. allies and partners. But are there areas where Japan could or should or might want to think about doing more in terms of networking these allies together?
Great question. Well, I think that, I don't mean to be lavish in my praise of Japan, but I think that Japan has done a pretty impressive job in both diplomatic and security policy networking, on top of a pretty strong tradition of economic networking, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, but more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, and obviously the Japan-India, Abe-Modi friendship, I think blazed something of a trail and may have contributed to greater openness on the part of Delhi for engagement with the United States, Australia, and others. So whether you look at South Asia or you look at the Pacific Islands or you look at Southeast Asia, I think that there is already a strong record and a strong tradition of Japanese engagement, networking, et cetera. And that's important and relevant in the security context because it's part of what has built confidence that Japan's enhanced defense capabilities aren't somehow an echo of the 1930s. There is one thing that lags that is absolutely critical to the security of the United States and the security of Japan, and that is trilateral security cooperation with South Korea. There is a base of basic cooperation, much of which is managed and conducted by the United States, acting as the sort of shuttle agent to bring data back and forth and so on. That's not sustainable for the reason that the security situation in the region, the threat profile, particularly from North Korea, is so serious, so dangerous, that none of the three countries can afford anything less than complete, efficient, unfettered cooperation and coordination. Information sharing is critical, and particularly in today's era of highly automated weapon systems. There's no room anymore for a phone call. We have to be wired together, and so there clearly is political hope right now of on improvement in relations between Tokyo and Seoul. I've been around this issue for my entire career. I'm not naive, but I think that the two countries are better positioned now than perhaps at any time in memory. That, I think, is absolutely number one. I'd say, secondly, Rory, that Japan has been part of a trilateral security dialogue with the U.S. and Australia for years. We're now starting to see that really increase in productivity, shall we say. And of course, now there's the Quad, or the Quad 2.0. And here too, I think it's not that this is a security partnership per se. It is an example of like-minded democracies combining their capabilities to provide public goods to the entire region and to demonstrate that democracies not only perform and produce, but can outperform China and the other autocracies. So there's clearly more that Japan can do in terms of networking, both diplomatically and security-wise, but I think it has accomplished a lot.
Thanks, Danny. I think we'll probably end up coming back to North Korea, if not in this discussion, among the questions that might come from our audience, which we'll get to in just a minute. So please start thinking now about what you might want to ask our two experts. But I also want to go back to the point, Professor Jimbo, that you made in your presentation that also struck me in looking at these documents, that there's really a change in looking at how globalization is seen as either an opportunity or a challenge in maintaining peace and stability across the world. So I want to focus a little bit on economic coercion. This is an area where Japan has stood up some positions and departments at very high levels in the government to consider economic security, because Japan is facing the same challenges that the U.S. and many other countries in the region are facing, where it needs to participate in economic activity with countries, particularly China, with which it has security and political disputes. And it knows that these economic relationships can be and often are used as leverage in those disputes. So how is Japan navigating its own economic security in the context of these bigger geopolitical and geoeconomic trends?
Sure. First of all, Japan promotes the free and open Indo-Pacific, and we are supporting WTO-based, like global economic interactions for the business environments. And we were promoting the CPTPP, RCEP type of the regional economic mechanisms that includes Chinese, commitment, especially on the RCEP and those. Japanese business firms have been robust investments in China. Now, 13,000 Japanese companies are operating in the mainland China. Most of them are having profits. And investment return rates for the Japanese firms are so high in China. So there has been a lots of, I think, benefits, and Japanese and Chinese are all the beneficiaries of those global economy. But now, there are lots of things that happened in past 5 years, especially the heightened U.S.-China strategic competitions. And from one side at the China, what has been said is the weaponizing the interdependence, according to many of the, the leadership words that globalization is good for China because everybody depends on China, and that kind of status could be materialized as a counter, measures against those who invested in China, those rely on China, and China has more power in the global affairs by utilizing this interdependent situation, and that is really a kind of politicization of the state of the interdependent relationship. Whereas the United States will try to adopt the economic security as a national security agenda since 2018 national security strategy, and all those kind of regulatory measures is now under the National Security Authorization Act, including export control, high-tech transfer, control measures, investment restrictions, and also the public procurements. So it is no longer the free, kind of investment and the trade behaviors that the companies in Japan and Europe can plug and play into those fields. And especially by looking at the semiconductors, large-scale batteries, rare earth minerals, and medical goods are now under the scope of the, the reliable, resilient supply chains, which we try to ask Japanese firms to get out of the Chinese markets, because we don't want to heavily rely on the specific products to be hijacked by Chinese policy measures. And that can happen to semiconductor, that can happen to the medical affairs. And we really have to pursue those resilient measures by ourselves. So this is the, I think, a logic behind that our passing of the National Economic Security Promotion Act back in May last year, where we try to emphasize two major concepts, which is the strategic autonomy and also the strategic indispensability. On the strategic autonomy, we will have a more like a resilient kind of supply chain measures, how to diversify the important and critical goods away from the, rely on the one specific countries to diversify its sources. And by strategic indispensability, we try to hover some of those Japanese, high-tech products to be, maintained in the Japanese domestic product through the subsidies, and also to lots of like stimulus measures to, promote the future generation kind of technologies to be produced in Japan. And something that I found, is this is the reality of what's been happening in the supply chain review processes. But at the same time, there's always the tendency that the protectionist kind of, tendency will come out and play. And those are the nature. If that, when we look at the globalized, the market access is concerned, where the emerging nation will adopt either Chinese ecosystem types of the tech products or something from Japan, US, and Europe, will be based upon the competitiveness of our products and services. And if we have a resilient supply chain networks, which will only create our products less competitive than the Chinese, what's going to happen is that, through the economic security measures, we will induce the very weak status of our economy. So that is not something that we are aiming at. So that I think this is something we are carefully try to pursue, how the economic vibrancy and the economic resiliency can go hand in hand with each other.
Absolutely. I think that is the key question that many countries and global businesses are also facing. I am going to open this up for questions in just 1 minute, but before we do that, I would like to ask about Taiwan. I'd like to ask both of you, actually, a similar question. So Danny, I'll start with you, and then Professor Jimbo, I'd like to get your reactions as well. I'm interested in exploring with both of you how to manage the security dilemma around Taiwan in the context of new defense policy. So often when our defense strategies focus on capabilities and when we're trying to match capabilities with an adversary, in this case China, which has been described as a pacing challenge by the U.S. Department of Defense, is clearly playing a key role in Japan's security strategy. We can sometimes end up creating the problem that we're seeking to avoid. So we build up our military in response to PLA modernization. The PLA looks at that, configures its capabilities to match ours, and we end up looking at Taiwan, which is primarily a political problem, through the lever of military lenses. Danny, what, if anything, can be done to reframe the issue set so that not only are we looking at, the capabilities of China to, use force against Taiwan to solve the political issue, but we're also creating an environment that's shaping the intentions?
Tough question. Well, I think that just building on the theme that Ken has been describing of the transformation in Japan's security strategy, that even though that is a defense strategy, a security strategy, I think that it can and will have the effect of creating more political space and time for progress to be made in cross-strait relations, because to the extent that the risk of military conflict over Taiwan is a function of bilateral U.S.-China strategic rivalry, the parties aren't going to get to the core of the underlying issues. Taiwan can become, and in some views has become, something of a proxy or a pawn for U.S.-China struggle. The fact that Japan has explicitly communicated, has signaled that the fate of Taiwan is existentially important to Japan, that the security of Taiwan and the maintenance of the status quo and a rule-based order is central to Japan's own security, I think changes the dynamic. It helps ensure that the issue of Taiwan is no longer easily seen in Beijing as strictly an issue between Washington and the Chinese Communist Party. So that's a sort of intrinsic good. Beyond that, the strategy of isolating Taiwan and demoralizing the public on Taiwan is going to be less successful to the extent that a powerful Asian country is say, kind of emotionally, psychologically, politically, economically making common cause with Taiwan, even though neither Japan nor the United States, of course, diplomatically recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. So I think that the function is creating some space in addition to the not inconsiderable deterrence that flows from the conclusion that the Japanese government has reached, which is that any change by virtue of force or coercion to the status quo in the Taiwan Straits is a direct threat to the national security and the national goals of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Jimbo, anything to add to
Sure.
Danny's analysis?
Basically, I agree fully with what Danny has laid out on Taiwan. But in addition to that, I guess it is quite important to deal with the risk of underestimation of the issues from either side. From like a Chinese perspective, if they take adventurous steps and they think that the United States will not respond, so as Japan, and Japan will be wedged if China takes the steps to intimidate the Japanese role in the crisis, and then they can go in. And that kind of underestimation should be denied by demonstration of United States and Japan's commitment to the peace over the Taiwan Strait. So the demonstration, strategic communication, how we can prepare for that potential scenarios, and all the planning processes among U.S. military and Japanese self-defense force is essentially needed. So the upgrading of the preparedness is something to be demonstrating to any Chinese stakeholders that we are ready to respond in times of the crisis. But it doesn't really mean that we should try to change the basic policy towards Taiwan, especially on challenging the One China principle policy towards them, because we maintain the course that the cross-strait relation should be solved through the peaceful means, and the willing of the mainland and Taiwanese people should be mutually respected. It doesn't mean that there will be an all-way kind of support to change the so-called the ambiguous policy to more like a strategic reality, or the challenging of the One China policy into a completely new one. I think that is the excessive way to deal with that situation. If we could overemphasize the risks, or the underestimating the kind of the long standing kind of the premises, how the U.S.-China, Japan-China diplomatic relationship have been playing out. Are we preparing for that kind of a tectonic shift of the defending Taiwan? I don't think we are. So in that sense, that the maintaining the status quo is essentially important. We have to upgrade the capability, but we have to really carefully try to deal with the diplomatic status vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Thank you both. I'd like to turn it over to our audience now. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'd like to take 2 or 3, please, right here. Yes.
Thank you. The National Economic Security Law is going to phase in, I think, 2 years. So do you think that is enough time for companies to decouple from China? And the government is saying that national security should be a more important one than efficiency. And do you think that will be applicable? And number 2, we had members from APEC last, I think, two weeks ago. And APEC is Russia and China. Russia and China are members of APEC, but you have the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which does not include both China and Russia. Don't you think that there's some kind of conflict there? I don't know, how do you manage a conflict of interest? Thank
Sure.
you.
May I?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. So 2 questions here. One about the ability of companies to adjust to the new law, and the second about APEC versus IPEF. What are kind of the complementarities or differences?
Sure. Definitely that will depends upon which sector you are in and what kind of products you are dealing with. So especially we have identified 20 items or areas of the specific products that is identified as critical important technologies. And the private firms dealing with those products are encouraged to make their supply chain more resilient. And if they need to return those production bases back in Japan, they were subject to receive the government subsidies. And if that works out in coming years, there will be, I think, a huge shift in the fragmentation of the supply chain that we have built since 1980s and 90s. But in terms of the commodity technologies, I think there will be, business as usual relationship to be played out in the wider supply chain networks in Asia that inclusive of China. By looking at the numbers of the trade, I think 2021 marked one of the largest amount of the trade in Japan-China relationship. And that is, basically the recovery from the COVID is one thing, but at the same time that the commodity type of the transaction, even under the heavy U.S.-China strategic competition, is currently, play out in the business affairs. So these are the two realities that has been simultaneously ongoing. But as you might suspect, once that investment takes place, it is very hard to get out because it's a heavily embedded supply chain that has been already created. So even under the subsidy opportunities, I think the company's priority should be paid. I think placed on much on the rationality on the businesses rather than the rationality on the economic security. And then I think the METI and the government really needs to understand the private sector decision, how it plays out. And secondly, on your question too about the regional economic framework, I think there has been three major things going on, and one is the CPTPP, and that is the high standard economic cooperation framework, and that has the market access, and there is basically that they will try to aim for the zero tariff relations in the participating countries. And the RCEP that includes China and Korea, Japan all the time. It is not as high standards as the CPTPP, but it is another, I think, very important framework for boosting the business relationship in Asia. And then now the Indo-Pacific economic framework comes in, and that is based upon that U.S., Japan, plus like-minded states in Asia without the market access pledges, but I think more like a rule-making aspects on the resilient supply chains, environment and labor types of the standard setting, and also the measures for the anti-corruptions, carbon neutral policies. It's all functional issues, but I think it provides a very important institutional linkage with the U.S. Department of the Commerce and USTR with those counterparts in the Asia Pacific. Since the United States is not a member of the CPTPP, by the way, Japan really waits for the U.S. kind of political kind of atmosphere will allow the United States to eventually come back to the CPTPP. But meanwhile, it is critically important to get the institutional connection between those, Department of Commerce and their counterparts, not only with Japan, also with those countries in Indo-Pacific. So I think IPEF has been playing the quite important role in those aspects.
We have another question here from Professor Murphy. While she's getting the microphone, I'd like to put a plug in for our own report, Reimagining the TPP, in which our Vice President of International Trade, Wendy Cutler, looked at all of the changes that might need to take place or be revised in the original TPP, CPTPP agreement in order to facilitate a U.S. reentry. So please do check that out. Professor Murphy.
Professor Jimbo, I want to thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation. And I want to ask you about the networking that Japan intends to do now with Southeast Asia. As Danny says, Japan is viewed as the most trusted partner among all Southeast Asian countries. In this book that was published recently, Japan as a courteous power, obviously a staunch contrast with perceptions of the U.S., you said that one of the reasons that Japan was able to enhance security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries was by studiously avoiding anything that could be seen as counterbalancing with China. Now that these documents clearly identify China as a threat, A, are you worried about how that might impact policy? And if so, what changes might it entail in the future of Japan-Southeast Asian ties? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is an excellent question. And I think that there are different layers of our policy towards Southeast Asia. In the institution-wise, that we fully support the ASEAN's effort to make their region more resilient. I think that what we need to have is strong Southeast Asia, both politically and economically, try to lead the institutional processes to engage the major powers to plug and play in the ASEAN Plus frameworks, which is, I think, working well for everybody. If that rule-making could be materialized through those East Asian Summit type of the processes, and that is conducive to many partners rather than where United States, Japan, or Korea will take a lead to come to the region and tell Southeast Asia what to do. And I think that will not really work out. So that, types of the policy is quite important. And this is one of the reasons why when ASEAN adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is really encouraging, but in the contents, it is quite different from the Japanese and the US versions. But we definitely encourage ASEAN to take a lead in the institutionalization processes. But we also find that there has been a huge gap between what ASEAN can do versus what is developing in Southeast Asia on the power-wise. And then we will try to approach by looking at the expansion of the capability through those capability building processes of the law enforcement, maritime capability of the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, having a kind of inputs to the Coast Guard capability together, strategic financing towards those, and that you mentioned about those kind of balancing actors are certainly incorporated, but through those kind of non-provocative measures, because it's a law enforcement capability that everybody needs, that is much better than putting the resources directly to the military, but beneath the surface, that kind of the law enforcement capability should be something that we have prioritized. But on the top, what has been happening is the balancing aspects are certainly could be involved with the. I think Danny has spent a lot of time in relation with the Philippines, and there has been hard times in the U.S.-Philippine relationship for several years. But under the new government, now the EDCA, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, has been reactivated. And if the U.S.-Philippines security relationship will be enhanced, that will also create the room for the Japanese self-defense force to also have a good security connection with the Philippines. And Danny mentioned about the Roto triangles, but the new triangle can also be made in cooperation with the Philippines and also other Southeast Asian countries. And if that could create the kind of better strategic depth for U.S. operating in the region, Japanese access to the region, and that will enhance the deterrence and defense capability of Southeast Asia. And that is something that we can explore further. On that scale, that is not our policy towards ASEAN, but I think we have to be dealing with the individual Southeast Asian countries for the enhancement of the security measures on that scale.
One final question, and then we'll close out. And while you're waiting for the microphone, thank you so much to everyone who's come here today. Especially want to thank our members who are here today. If you're not a member of the Asia Society, please know that our membership support is critical to hosting programs such as this one and to doing all of our work. Consider signing up, and also please check our website for upcoming events. We have Pico Iyer tomorrow on his book, The Half-Known Life, and we do a wide variety of events across business, policy, and culture. So please check back often or sign up for our newsletters to hear a little bit more about what we're doing at Asia Society. Final question.
Thank you. Well, I have a question for both Professor Jimbo and Mr. Russel. This question is related to a security concern and networking. I'm from Taiwan, and just like Japan, the majority of our people want to maintain a peaceful and prosperous Asia-Pacific region. And during your presentation, you mentioned a couple of security concerns on the part of Japanese government, including China, North Korea, and you also mentioned Senkaku. And of course, you did mention the adventurism in Taiwan Strait. Given the fact that Taiwan is not a member of the various alliances in the region, what can Japan, U.S. do, or what can Taiwan do for Taiwan to play a more important role in order to contribute to the regional security and peace? Thank you.
Let's start with Danny, actually. Danny and then Professor Jimbo. A complex question, but let's keep the answer as short as is reasonable.
Well, Taiwan has found, I think, effective ways to demonstrate its contribution and its ability to contribute to regional interests through disaster relief, through the global training program, and through its southbound economic policies as well. And that kind of integration that's not dependent on statehood, et cetera, that doesn't take place in multinational institutions, but that is hugely valuable, I think is, in a way, a precursor of the Quad, in the sense that industrialized societies and economies like Taiwan have a lot to offer. I think that the ability of Japan and the United States, quite apart from the overt security element, to contribute to Taiwan resilience, both in economic terms, but also in civil defense, is a major area of, is an asset. And that that kind of integration, learning from each other, sharing experience, capabilities, lessons learned, is another place where Taiwan, the U.S., Japan, as well as other countries can collectively and valuably coordinate.
Professor Jimbo, maybe 1 minute on this.
Sure. I recognize how important Taiwan has been in the era of economic security in terms of the supply chain review on critical technologies, semiconductor. Taiwan is definitely the center of the major players in these schemes. So we definitely need strategic coordination over how the resiliency of the supply chain measures could be pursued through Taiwanese counterparts, business sectors, and the policymakers, and those are something that we really need to bring in Taiwanese representation of the voices in creating the stable economic order in Asia. Secondly, we talk a lot about the deterrence, but deterrence needs the understanding of what kind of message we would like to send with each other, not only to the adversary, but among ourselves. So our message has to be coordinated in the deeper sense, what kind of coordination to be materialized among our counterparts. That should not be pursued only between Washington and Tokyo, but I think we have to have Taiwanese voices, recognitions, and messaging to be coordinated altogether. We really need to find a way how we can materialize it, and which needs a deeper coordination, collaboration with the Taiwanese counterparts.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking our two speakers today for a comprehensive conversation. And thank you all for your time.